So there was this little game on Game Boy called Kirby's Dreamland. Don't know if you've heard of it. It was honestly kind of lackluster. Not a bad game, and it didn't have anything going for it. It had a weird idea that you could only attack by sucking up enemies and spewing them back out, but that led to frustrating bosses that needed you to constantly wait for an opening. Dreamland was only about 20 to 30 minutes too. I love me some short games, but that is too short. Especially when there's a boss rush and you're doing things you already did 10 minutes ago. But they were willing to give the game another shot, so they gave it a full-fledged sequel on the NES a year later. Wow, Kirby was older than I thought. When was that? What the hell? They released an NES game in 1993. In the US, the Super Nintendo was nearly 2 years old at this point. Kirby's Adventure came out the same year as Super Mario All-Stars, Secret of Mana, and Mega Man X. Did they want this game to fail? I get that console successors were a new thing back then, but it didn't take a genius to know this game wouldn't sell. Okay, actually it did. Apparently. I wasn't really expecting that. This is why you do research. But point is, Kirby's Adventure was fondly remembered despite what it would seem on the surface. So much that they remade the game on Game Boy Advance 9 years later in the form of Nightmare and Dreamland. I'm looking at both versions of the game because despite being the same game in the core, they were two different experiences in practice. So, Kirby's Adventure. I've never finished this one. I don't know, I'd already played Nightmare and Dreamland more times than I can count, so I guess I just never felt the need to. Plus, I always remember the game feeling slow compared to the remake, but I couldn't remember why specifically. Well, no use padding it out any longer, let's look at the first real Kirby game. Booting up Kirby's Adventure gives you a drawing tutorial? Alright then, might as well try.
I don't know what happened.
Waiting on the title screen gives you a how-to-play movie, which through NES is almost unheard of. Most games just taught you through game design because they didn't have the space for actual tutorials. The most famous being 1-1 of Super Mario Bros. There was a Goomba you gotta jump over, so you learn to jump and hit blocks right off the bat. Most NES games had this stuff in the manual, but Kirby has it in-game. That's cool. The tutorial is pretty overkill though. They tell you every ability despite also showing what the ability does when you obtain it. It's impressive with the system, but just unnecessary, but still cool. The actual story though, the residents of Dreamland stop having dreams one day, and it turns out that King Dedede stole the Star Rod from the Fountain of Dreams, so Kirby has to go stop him. I wasn't really expecting much else. Gameplay-wise, Kirby's Adventure isn't too different from Dreamland. You still got the same abilities as before, but Kirby plays much better overall. A big thing last time was how long it took to puff up and fly. The animation just felt like it took too long. He takes up less of the screen too, so being able to see what's ahead is much easier. NES games were infamous for being ball-bustingly difficult due to technical limitations, but Kirby's Adventure doesn't even bother to be NES hard. Not that it needed to, that was half the appeal of Kirby. It's supposed to be easy and accessible, just very abnormal for the system. But we all know what this game introduced. The very thing that makes Kirby, copy abilities. Yeah, believe it or not, Kirby didn't get his most well-known trait until his second game. You suck up an enemy, and if you're flashing when they're inhaled, you can press down to swallow it and get a new attack for yourself. Like, you eat a beam shooting waddle dude, then you can do it too. Eat this fire breathing dude, and oh my, how crude. Eat the guy with the sword, and you're no longer bored. You know what, stop the pointless rhyming. How does that even work? Maybe the real ability is being able to wield it effectively? I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be thinking about this. Copy abilities solved the main issue with Dreamland. You couldn't defend yourself effectively. You had to wait for a boss to hit you, dodge the attack, and then counterattack. And if you miss, you have to keep waiting because you only had one shot. Now you can just beat dudes up like in a normal video game, adding in a bit of a beat 'em up element. Along with being able to attack underwater, you pretty much always have a means to defend yourself now. That is, assuming you don't take a hit to lose your ability. It adds a ton of replayability too. Because of how many there are, you can keep using different abilities and essentially have different playstyles. Or you can just completely ignore it like a dumb 3-year-old who can't read the tutorial on the pause screen, but I'll get into that later. There's 24 abilities in the game, which is a lot more than I was expecting out of the NES. Even when you consider that Light is only used in very specific areas, Sleep is a joke ability, and Mike is literally just a better version of Crash that's still like 21 abilities. A lot of staples got their stored here as well. Beam, Sword, Ice, Fire, Crash, Cutter, Spark, etc. all in basically every game in the series. That's super cool. Adventure has its own weird abilities too, like there's Ball that just turns you into a bouncy ball of death. It's really cumbersome to use, but it lets you kill bosses laughably easy when you know how to use it. Then there's Backdrop that lets you judo flip enemies just because. Throw is incredibly redundant though. You inhale enemies and spit them back out. You can already do that. Why do I need a copy ability for this? It at least does a lot of damage, but spitting out enemies do that too. Why does this exist? I'm kind of bummed out laser doesn't get much love after this. It's pretty basic, but I always thought that ricocheting off slopes could lead to some cool ideas. Unlike Dreamland, where we go from stage to stage, you enter each stage through a hub area. When you finish a level through this glowing store door at the end, you play a minigame for a chance at some extra lives, and then unlock the next level. I love the animation too. Seeing Kirby slam down that flag and blow up blocks to the next level always felt super satisfying to me. But this game actually has secrets to find. Hidden in some levels are these secret switches that unlock more stuff in the hub area. Stuff like museums to get free copy abilities, sub-games for chances at extra lives, coliseums to refight some mini-bosses as another easy way to get an ability, and occasionally warp stores to travel from level to level. A really nice detail is that the stage door will stay red after you beat it to let you know you missed the switch. I love how subtle that is. I didn't even notice it as a kid until I wondered why a few doors stayed red after finishing them. The extras you get from secret switches can vary in quality though. I hate how they have to unlock the warp rooms for the later levels. In the early levels you unlock the warp room when you unlock the stage boss, so why do I need to find a secret switch all of a sudden? What's the point? I can already walk back to the previous levels. Why not just giving the warp room like the earlier ones did? The museums are the most useful unlocks. Instead of having to track down the ability you want and leave the stage, you can just hop over to one of these instead. My only issue is that there was only 8 abilities accounted for. So if you want Cutter, for instance, that's one of the ones you actually have to track down. Even when there's 5 more abilities covered via arenas, there's still a few abilities that aren't so easy to get if you go for 100%. By the off chance you want to use Ice, Cutter, Spark, Needle, Parasol, or Beam, then you gotta go find them. No one's really losing sleep over Throw, Needle, and Parasol, and Spark and Beam can be easily found in the first room in the first level, but if you want to use Cutter or Ice, you have to go and find them. And even then, the whole point of museums is convenience, so why not just go all the way and include all of them? Seriously, who in their right mind thought it would be better to put Sleep instead of Cutter or Ice? And Wheel is in both a museum and an arena. Again, why? UFO, Crash, and Mike are also absent from these, but seeing as you can't take UFO into the hub area, and the single enemy that gives it never respawns unless the game's reset, it's rare by design. And considering how strong this thing is, it makes sense why it's rare. It also makes sense why Mike and Crash are on here, since even in an easy game like Kirby, you still don't want to give the player access to a limited use screen nuke whenever they want. That would probably make things a bit too easy. The missing abilities aren't really a huge issue though, especially since you don't need any of them for the secret switches. It would have just been nice is all. The other thing you'll find are the sub-games. They're just little mini-games to play for some extra lives and points that do not matter in the slightest. The ones in Adventure are just alright. There's Egg Catcher where you just hold down hold A to eat the eggs to avoid eating the bombs. So like, he just eats the eggs with the shell? Look, I know we devour living beings whole on a regular basis, but I'm gonna have to draw the line there. That's disgusting. Next is Crane Fever, which is just as awful as it sounds. But one time I got 2 big Kirbys in the same round and I felt like a god afterwards. It was awesome. The only sub-game I really like is Quick Draw. Alright, it's just reaction times, but that Old West Showdown vibe is just really cool. I love the later animations too. Where did Kirby find a rocket launcher? Although I could never get past the bonkers. This asshole just seems to be like 1 frame faster than me. It could be emulator lag on NES Classic though. Too bad I don't have a real NES to see if I can do better. The secret switches themselves aren't too hard to find for the most part though. They're mostly just well hidden secrets, but it is a real pain when these cannon fuses don't reset. Like, it makes sense, but if you mess up, you have to leave the room and come back for no reason. And if there isn't a 2-way door in the room, then you have to replay the whole level before you get another shot at it. That's so dumb. Thank God for save states. A few of these are really cryptic though. Like this one, where we not only have to notice there's a block that looks slightly different, but also go into an invisible door behind it. Like, the hell, man? Oh, and that potent orange ocean where we need to destroy a block that looks totally normal with Hammer, run through like 3 invisible doors, and then replace Hammer with Laser to set off a cannon can screw right off. If I remember right, this was the last switch I needed to get as a kid. I spent hours trying to figure this garbage out. I don't know why, but I remember finally figuring it out at Dairy Queen of all places. It's an odd association I always had with this room. Oh, and the one where we need one of 2 specific abilities to, again, break a block that doesn't seem breakable is still dumb. And the best part is that neither ability is even in the level unless you go around mixing abilities. Yeah, that's the thing that I forgot to mention. If you get 2 copy abilities at once by swallowing 2 enemies at the same time, you get a pseudo-random one. It's probably adding them together in the ability list or something, but it's random to you few at least. None of these switches ever get Dreamland too bad though. You know, it's actually kind of shocking that Dreamland 2 is more cryptic despite coming out after Adventure. Whatever, Howdy went down that rabbit hole. Kirby's Adventure has one fatal flaw though. The frame rate, like holy hell. This is probably the best looking game on the NES, but good god, I can almost feel this poor thing screaming in agony. The NES wasn't exactly known for having the most stable frame rates around, but Kirby's got it real bad. You can't do anything without the game practically going into slow motion. It got so bad at times that every now and then I opted to leave my ability behind because retrieving it felt like too much of a hassle. And god forbid you want to use Spoke or Freeze, in which case you become a walking lag machine. Spoke's always been one of my favorites, so to see it make the game so unplayable is really unfortunate. I hadn't finished the OG Kirby's Adventure before this, and it is not hard to see why. All I remembered was that it felt way clunkier than Nightmare and Dreamland, but god, I didn't think this was why. And this frame rate makes the game really unresponsive at times, because I swear there were points where I hit the B button and nothing happened before I got hit. The game felt weirdly glitchy too. I got stuck in this wall once just casually playing the game, which definitely hasn't happened to me in any other Kirby game. Look, Kirby's Adventure is a game I still really liked, but the frame rate makes it a slog to go through at times. And it's a shame because I really respect Kirby's Adventure. They took a game that felt as generic as Dreamland and turned it into something completely unique. That's not easy. Copy abilities gave the series its own identity beyond being an easy kids game, and being released on NES after the Super Nintendo certainly didn't help Kirby's exposure, which is why it was still a fairly obscure series at this point in time. But that made the game prime remake material. So now we turn to Kirby Nightmare and Dreamland, one of the first games I ever played. I say one of because I was either this or Pokemon Silver. One Christmas, my parents were just like, hey, have a Game Boy. And I was like,
Okay.
And then I booted up Silver/Kirby, and I never grew out of either despite everyone saying that I would eventually. Yeah, one of the first games I played turned out to be a remake. I didn't even know that until I was a teenager. I thought Adventure was a completely different game. I think I was like 3 at the time. Okay, I guess I was at least 4, and because I couldn't read yet, I didn't know copy abilities were a thing. So I played pretty much the whole game without knowing about Kirby's main gimmick. I want to say I got to around the 5th world when I accidentally pressed down and got Beam, and it was like I had a whole new game. And what were the odds that on some random level, I got the ability you were supposed to get first? That's crazy, man. Actually, the level I was thinking of was in the 1st world, but I know for a fact it was on a replay, so I don't know, I misremembered. Memories aside, I haven't played Nightmare and Dreamland in years, and from what I remember, it fixes pretty much every issue I had with the original release. So hopefully this still ends up as one of my favorites in the series. Dude, this is how the game should have been from the beginning. You know how the Super Nintendo had already been out for a few years when Adventure was released? Nightmare and Dreamland is the alternate reality where they just made Adventure for the SNES instead. It's crazy how much better this version of the game is simply because it runs at a locked 60 FPS. All those sections in the original that played in slow motion don't even register as problem areas anymore. The controls got a big improvement too. It just feels way better to play. You can hold A to fly now instead of holding up an A, which just feels much smoother. And because of the improved playability, it's pretty easy to see how well the game design has aged. While the levels are short, they're a blast to go through. Even when I missed a secret switch, I didn't mind going back into it for another round. And most of the time, if you can't find the ability you need for a secret switch, it turns out you can just eat 2 enemies at once to get what you need. It could have been a bit more obvious, but if my dumbass could figure it out, then it's not too bad. I'm assuming it was like that on NES too, but because of how slow everything felt, I never bothered trying to experiment. The only time I needed to bring in another ability was maybe Yogurt Yard 6 with this hammer block that you need to destroy. That's another thing, the puzzles are less cryptic now. There's no more blocks that you can't tell that you can destroy, and hidden entrances at least have some kind of marker. Like the block that looks slightly different has this red thing now to show that an object's there. It's still subtle enough to be missable, but not so subtle you can't tell it's there. That part in Orange Ocean with needing multiple abilities is like this too. All the doors are much easier to notice without being too obvious. All those cannon fuses reset if you mess up now, which is practically orgasmic. God, that was a pain in the ass before. A few abilities got buffed as well, most notably Needle. In the original, the range on this thing was so small that it was practically worthless, but the range is much better now, and you have spikes below you too. It's honestly one of my favorite abilities now. There's just something oddly satisfying about impaling things with a spike and then hearing that pop when you defeat an enemy. I love the whooshes that Sword has now, that feels real good. This spinning air slash really reminds me of Zero's spinning slash from Mega Man. It's just satisfying to use too. There's no more not using abilities because they lag too much, which means that Spark is actually usable now, as unimpressive as that sounds. I really wish that you could jump when using wheel though. That's just a basic thing that could have been improved, but it's not too big of a deal. There are a few changes I don't like though. Meta Knight used to give you a candy every now and then, showing that he's helping Kirby and might not necessarily be a bad guy. It was a nice touch that got lost in translation because it's not there at all on GBA. Not a huge deal, but it definitely loses a little charm. And the part where you have to run around the tower is replaced by just awkwardly waiting for the fog to clear. Why? That's such a weird thing to change. I really don't like the little delay laser has either. Before, it was instant, but now you have to wait for Kirby to put on his Cyclops goggles. I would have preferred if he was just always wearing them. Some of the secrets feel a little too obvious now, but the bad changes are pretty small in the grand scheme of things. Just how much more fun I was having with Nightmare in Dreamland speaks for itself. They even added a co-op mode. That's badass. It does require 2 copies of the game, but dude, I never knew anyone who had this game growing up, so I'd love to play this with someone one day. But if you only have 1 copy, you can at least play the sub-games together, which got completely changed from Adventure, and for the better in my opinion. My issue with the original sub-games was how unfun they were. I just didn't like playing them, but here I like all of them. First up is Air Grind. You hold A and let go of it to avoid the bumpy ports of the rail, but if you time your A presses and releases right, you get a small speed boost. It's simple and honestly kind of easy, but at least it'll net you a few easy lives. Bomb Rally is easily my favorite of the 3. It's hot potato with a bomb. That's awesome, I love it, even if I suck at it. And the final one is Quick Draw. Again. But now it has this feudal Japan samurai theme, and it even has this manga art style. Dude, that's so badass. Sure, we don't have Kirby with a gun anymore, but the aesthetics alone make this. Overall though, Nightmare in Dreamland is such a massive improvement over the original. I remember Adventure being really slow and clunky, but after playing them back to back, I really can't emphasize how much faster it feels. That is the power of a remake, ladies and gentlemen. There was a fantastic game buried underneath Adventure's clunky and slow exterior, and Nightmare in Dreamland dug it out. I probably won't ever touch Adventure again after this, but Nightmare in Dreamland is easily my top 5 favorite Kirby games. It's that big of an improvement. Nightmare in Dreamland is a bit shorter than Adventure, but I'm not sure how much of that is me knowing the game now, and how much of that is from no longer playing it in slow motion. I kinda wish I had more to say about Nightmare in Dreamland though. It has the same issues the original had, so it's kind of a bare bones remake in that regard. But the frame rate made this game borderline unplayable at times, so increasing the performance is all it really needed to do. Well, I guess I haven't talked about the bosses yet. They're alright for the most part. Wispy Woods is Wispy Woods. This painter dude is a cool idea, but piss easy once you figure out a decent ability to use. The Sun and Moon I always really liked. It's just fun to have 2 bosses that take turns getting the crap beat out of them. Krako is a cool use of high jump, but the sequence before fighting him is honestly more fun than actually fighting him. The drill mole thing is just alright. You just need Hammer, Ball, or Tornado to completely decimate him. Meta Knight is pretty interesting though. No matter how long you stand there, Meta Knight refuses to fight you unless you take the sword and get into a good old duel to the death. And if you take damage, you don't lose your ability for once, which is nice. That's the annoying part about bosses in this game. Normally, I'm okay with losing your ability once you get hit, since you have a chance to get it back, but during boss fights, it's pretty common to take multiple hits before being able to actually attack your opponent again. It just makes bosses more frustrating than they need to be. Defeating Meta Knight reveals that he looks shockingly similar to Kirby. It's never actually been revealed what his relation to Kirby is, but there's a pretty common theory I've always liked that Meta Knight is an adult of Kirby's species. I think they're called Star Children. The theory goes that when Star Children become adults, they pick a copy ability to have permanently and become far more proficient in that ability than they would be otherwise. With Meta Knight obviously being Sword. Maybe it's just reading way too deep into a kid's game, but you'd be surprised at how much lore Kirby has. Not so much at this point in the series, but man, it's wild how deep this rabbit hole goes. Also, as a kid, I was convinced that you could collect the sword that Meta Knight drops somehow, but you can't, unfortunately. Just one of those things you'd hear on the elementary school playground, like Poke Gods, or Luigi in Mario 64, or Sonic in Melee. Before the final boss, let me talk about the final level, which is a really cool idea. It's a tribute to Kirby's Dreamland, and it's all in black and white. They even went the extra mile and changed the HUD and enemies too. It's an awesome touch. It's a bit short, but it's a neat way to end the game. Although for some reason, the secret switch is found by going into the moon? How are you supposed to figure this out? I also don't like how few enemies there are with copy abilities. It would have made it feel less like the original, but more fun to see how far the series has come in such a short span of time. I don't know, maybe they wanted it to feel more like the original. Nightmare in Dreamland doesn't change the HUD or the enemies, which is a shame, but not as big of a deal as other people make it out to be. The final boss is actually kind of challenging, at least. With his hard-to-dodge attacks and big hitbox, King Dedede puts up a good fight. This took me a few tries. You know, this fight is actually pretty similar to his Dreamland fight, but eventually I got him to cutter from a distance like a sissy baby man. He felt oddly satisfying to beat. That was a nice surprise. But after kicking his ass and taking back the Star Rod, the real final boss shows up. This is Nightmare, the actual bad guy of this game. Dedede sucks up Kirby with the Star Rod and the second phase starts. It's basically a 2D shooter, it's an alright phase. But the dumb thing is that there's an arbitrary time limit for some reason. Like, come on, I had one hit left. This looks hella cool though, I love the moon backdrop at the beginning. Afterwards, you fight Nightmare's true form on the moon. At least I think it's the moon, it's a lot cloudier than I remember. What is it with Nintendo games having the surface of the moon replaced with surreal visuals? Ironically, this third phase is the easiest out of the three. You basically just stand in the corner and hit his underside when he unveils his cloak. You would jump with the Star Rod does damage too, but your projectile does way more. I don't know how this fight took me so long as a kid, because it's legitimately hard for me to lose when I start with full health. If you've made it this far, you can get past this. So yeah, it turns out that King Dedede wasn't a bad guy after all. Nightmare was causing everyone to have bad dreams, and Dedede hid the Star Rod away from Nightmare, figuring that no dreams were better than bad dreams. Everyone just assumed he had malicious intent behind it, and it turns out that wasn't the case. Not that I blame them, he did steal all the food in Dreamland. Like, are we just gonna forget about that, Mr. Triple D? But Kirby returns the Star Rod to the Fountain of Dreams, letting everyone dream again. While I'm not exactly playing Kirby for the story, this is a really cool twist. You don't expect the bad guy to actually be good, especially not in a kid's game. If you found all the secret switches in the game, you unlock a horde mode and a boss rush. The boss rush is pretty self-explanatory, but I always liked how Kirby makes them optional. It makes it feel less like padding and more like a fun challenge. Mega Man can learn a thing or 10 from this. But the best new thing in Nightmare and Dreamland is Meta Nightmare, where you play through the whole game again as Meta Knight. That's damn cool. I have a save with the Wii U release, so I don't have to play it all in one sitting anymore. I've never finished it, so let's jump into the... Wait, where's Meta Nightmare? Hold up. I have to finish extra mode for this? Ugh, you know what? I might as well talk about the horde mode. You play the game again, but with half the health as usual. That's pretty much it aside from Soda healing 1 HP instead of 2. Despite the fact that less health is supposed to make the game harder, it really doesn't. I finished extra mode at about the same time as the regular game. I just died more often. They even made the sub-games harder. Dude, Quick Draw requires such inhuman reflexes, I'm amazed anyone is able to beat this. I can't do better on real hardware than Wii U, but seriously, what the hell? Although I wasn't expecting to not mind replaying the game. Honestly, Nightmare and Dreamland is pretty fun to rush through. I've been kinda wanting to get into speedrunning, so maybe I'll try to run this game at some point. But wow, does extra mode make you better at the game. I was plowing through everything without even trying by the end. When I got to Dedede, I was surprised at how easy it was at this point. Even with half health, it only took me 2 tries, and I'm pretty sure that was only because my ability decided to poof out of existence on the first try. I was like, what should I beat up Dedede with this time? Sure, Tornado seems like a wacky thing to do. Wow, I thought this dude was hard? Oh my god. Man, that's one of the things I love about Kirby. You decide to fight a boss with some random ability just because, and it turns out it's an effective strategy. It adds a ton of replayability. Alright, Meta Nightmare for real this time. Meta Knight is basically an improved version of Sword, but he has no spinning slash, unfortunately. He can't fly either, but he can jump infinitely and only has 3 hits like in extra mode. The extra sword moves are nice, but I'm a bit of a basic bitch, so I usually use the regular slash a lot of the time. I also love how this dude Naruto runs everywhere. It really appeals to the edgy slash dumb 4th grader in me. God, how did I play so much Sonic Unleashed in middle school? And it was like the PS2 version. Meta Nightmare is the hardest this game gets. I died a lot too. This was the only time I saw the game over screen, and often. Does Meta Knight have a bigger hitbox or something? I didn't die nearly this much in extra mode. Meta Knight also doesn't get the bonus game at the end of each stage, or the sub game, so extra lives are pretty rare this time around. His sword can interact with everything required to activate all the secret switches, so you can 100% this mode, but you don't get anything from it. Half the switches don't even unlock anything. Don't bother, I'm just dumb. Meta Nightmare is basically the same game again, but as Meta Knight. They didn't even change Meta Knight sending his cronies after you. There is a part where you fight Meta Knight as Meta Knight, and it is so bizarre. Why not replace Meta Knight with one of those generic sword enemies? That would be funny at least. But you oddly can't save for some reason. I never got that. Why can't you just have a single save file for this? That really turned me off of this as a kid. It only took me about an hour to finish it, but if you're a kid and die even more than I did this time, it takes way longer. It's totally worth another playthrough though. It's an awesome extra mode. Also, there's a 3DS version for some reason. I'm not talking Virtual Console either. There is a native port of Kirby's Adventure on 3DS under the 3D Classics line. You remember when they did those? There are a few NES games with added 3D support, and a few even had updated graphics and improvements. Why the hell did Urban Champion get one though? Who cares about that game? It's kind of a shame they stopped doing these. Rebranding them as HD Classics on Switch would have been pretty neat, but Kirby's Adventure is probably the best one of the bunch because of how much it fixed. Aside from the 3D support, the graphics look slightly better, but they removed the slowdown, so this game actually feels playable now. But this does highlight my issues with the controls. Now that I know that the frame rate isn't the issue, the controls still feel clunky. There's this weird delay when doing things, and it just doesn't feel right. Even when smoke doesn't slow down time, it makes you realize that smoke sucks in Adventure, because the electricity field has little smokes that feel random instead of this field that instantly forms around you. Not to mention that freeze works exactly the way it should. It's instant. Also, I think needle attacks below you? There weren't spikes underneath, so I just assumed it didn't. I don't know, it just feels better in Nightmare and Dreamland. And that's my real takeaway from the 3DS version. Better than NES for sure, but GBA is still the smoother experience in my opinion. If it wasn't obvious by now, play Nightmare and Dreamland. While Kirby's Adventure was a good first stab at being an actual Kirby game, the controls haven't aged well. There's too much delay in your actions, and it makes you screw up way more than necessary. Even the graphics still look great, and the music sounds so much better in this version. I'm gonna be honest, when I was playing the 3DS version, I didn't feel the need to play through Adventure a second time, but I played through Nightmare and Dreamland 3 times for this review, and I had a blast every time. I love how much fun it is to replay this damn game. In fact, I'm almost tempted to do it again. Help me. I haven't played a Kirby game since Star Allies, and I gotta say, I forgot how much fun Kirby is. And if you want to get into the series, Nightmare and Dreamland is a good place to start. Although they give out Adventure like candy, so if you have a Switch, you're more than likely already able to play Adventure. Same with Superstore and Dreamland 3. Some people wouldn't see that as a bad thing though. I've heard about quite a few people preferring the NES version over GBA, and I honestly can't see it. It doesn't even feel like nostalgia either. Nightmare and Dreamland is just a better experience in every way that I legitimately have a hard time going back to Adventure. It's really weird. I've heard a lot of people say the same thing about Superstore Ultra. I guess we'll just have to see why next time. This has been Flame Guy, and in case you missed the announcement video, by the time this video goes public, the Kirby 64 review will already be done, so tune in next week for Superstore Ultra. Why? I don't know. Blame YouTube. Take care, and I'll see you all next mission.